Deputy Fitzmaurice.
First of all, thanks to the witnesses for coming in. In relation to, John, I've listened to what you had to say there. You talk about basically a cow eating, or 11 tonne of grass, and a certain amount that is this carbon in it, and a certain amount that has gone out through the milk, and then you talk about the methane, and you talk about stabilising numbers. Is that, does Professor Allen basically agree with your analysis of what you're saying? And I know, Professor Allen, you talked about, I saw something in the media yesterday about 3% over 10 years. What's your solutions? Can you give us a sort of your in-depth knowledge? Obviously, you have been on the international, were you on the panel on climate science, or on what were you doing? Could you explain climate science? Yeah. Could you explain that? And Ireland is basically a grass-based country, and as has been outlined already by the professor, that you know, this could move to other places that mightn't be as good at doing it. What would your solutions for Ireland be? And in the line of this word that's going around at the moment in relation to a cull of the national herd, which is, if you look at Holland at the moment, it's causing major problems. What would your solutions be in all the, basically all the science that you have looked at? And to Professor Mitloner, could you tell me, my understanding in California, or maybe some other state in America, they are using a seaweed that has been adapted by the, or say the government have given it the go-ahead, that has reduced the methane. And you all talk about basically, if you have a stable herd, go back, say 100 years, 80 years, 50 years, 30 years. What's the world herds like? Is it stable? Is it less? Or what's it like that way? And could you also tell me, have you looked at, say, we have seen spikes at times when gas wells and that weren't being capped, or we have seen, is there spikes associated with other things in basically methane compared with the farmer getting the bashing the whole time? And what would the percentage of that be? Dumps, another one. Look at it, I worked on a dump myself where they were redoing it down in Clare, and there's a flame burning there all the time because of where there was dumping done for years. What's the percentages that way? And how can we, you know, we keep looking at one road of where the agriculture is, but no one seems to be looking at where there was dumps put, or where there was gas wells that in some countries things weren't done too well. Could you give us a briefing on the likes of that, both of you? What's up?
So thank you, and thank you very much for bringing me in. I did prepare a short briefing note on technical matters, which I hope was made available to the committee, and which I'm happy to share with anybody who's not had a copy of that, because these are, well, I'm here to brief on specifically the matter of measurement of methane and its impact on global temperature. The broader policy questions you raised, given my citizenship and accent, I don't think I'm qualified to speak to them. But what I can do is, as a climate physicist, I can tell you a little bit about how I, as a physicist, sitting outside of this discussion, I do feel there's a lot of very unnecessary animosity in this. Because you mentioned the 3% per decade. If you are reducing methane emissions from whatever source by 3% per decade, which, as Frank mentioned, is entirely achievable, and in fact you can probably do much better than that, then those methane emissions are not contributing to any additional global warming. And I choose my words carefully here, because they will, in building up the herd back in the day, they will have contributed to global warming, And it's important to acknowledge that in any discussion about sectoral responsibilities. So when you're talking about agriculture's responsibilities, by all means talk about what Irish agriculture may have contributed to global warming in the past. But all I advocate is, and this is really just speaking as a scientist, please can we measure the impact of everything we discuss on global temperature. It's a source of some embarrassment to me that you have a method of characterizing environmental impact of greenhouse gases that doesn't actually reflect their impact on global temperature. And you're looking at me like, so what have you been doing for the past 30 years? And yes, you have a point. You should be looking at me like that. To be fair, we do know how to do it right. And there are ways of calculating, and they're relatively simple ways of calculating the impact of emissions on global temperature. And they were all well documented in the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And it is universally agreed among the scientists who work in this sector that that's what we should be documenting. And unfortunately, in our formal reporting requirements that we place on farmers and that we place on countries reporting to the UNFCCC, we're still using this old and frankly not fit for purpose metric of CO2 equivalent emissions, which doesn't actually reflect the impact of methane emissions on global temperature. So if I ask you to take one thing away from this afternoon, it's let Ireland be a policy pioneer in reporting the warming impact of policy on global temperature. And in the little briefing note, I just showed you a little graph to show what difference it makes. And just to sort of highlight one thing, if you look at the blue line, which is the actual impact if there's a little graph in the policy brief, and you can calculate the actual impact of Ireland's methane emissions on global temperature under a scenario in which you reduce by 51% by, just purely hypothetically, 51% by 2030, net zero in 2050. And I'm not suggesting that's a policy scenario, it's just to illustrate the point of the way these gases behave. In the figure, I'm comparing the dotted line which says what the CO2 equivalent metric, the sort of standard carbon footprint that we report that everybody uses, would suggest those methane emissions are doing. And one thing you'll notice is it underestimates the warming caused by Ireland's methane emissions to date. So it's not all saying, don't worry about methane at all, okay? But as soon as methane emissions start to decline, the actual impact on global temperatures follows them down. Whereas the carbon footprint calculation suggests that their warming impact carries on up. So it even gets the sign wrong when you move into a situation of declining methane emissions. So we're using a tool that doesn't reflect the impact of emissions on global temperature. Now, I'm not suggesting you abandon that tool because it's sort of embedded in international policy. I'm sure you'll carry on using it because everybody does. But I'm just suggesting one thing, which is you add in all reporting requirements. I suggest it could even be at the farm level. I mean, John with a pocket calculator could work out his impact on global temperatures so that we can target policies to maximize the reduction in global temperature. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to stop global warming. And that's what we should focus policy on. So that's my one sort of response to your many questions, is to document the impact, to report the impact of policies and emissions on global temperature. And it'd be a very easy innovation to do, and it's something your Climate Change Commission can already do. And if that was introduced into the conversation, I think it would do a great deal to diffuse the tension between the farming community and the government on this particular issue.
Dr. Mintner? Dr. Mintner, have you a comment?
Yes, so first of all, I do agree with everything Professor Allen just said. I do think that you need to have, or I would recommend using a matrix that's fit for purpose. It is absolutely critical to describe the impact of a sector on warming, because this is what it's all about. It's not about carbon equivalent emissions, it is about the impact the sector has on warming. And we want to stop additional warming and therefore find tools to get us there. You just asked me what herd sizes have done here in the United States over time. And indeed, there have been quite some changes. In fact, back in the 1950s, we had our peak in beef and dairy populations with 25 million dairy cows here in the country. Today, we don't have 25, we have 9 million today. And with this much smaller herd, we are producing 60% more milk, 60% more milk, which means that the carbon footprint of our dairy sector has shrunk by 2/3 over that period of time. So a drastic improvement in performance has led to a drastic reduction in the warming impact of the sector. And I already told you, most recent changes here in California have been, to me, they have been amazing. Over the last 5 years, the California dairy sector has reduced its methane by 30%, and that's all metered and validated by the different agencies in the state. And that has been made possible by the state incentivizing, and not penalizing, but incentivizing methane reductions, working hand in hand with our farmers and generating a market approach to incentivize, financially incentivize reductions of methane. That is a strategy that works. I have compared it to strategies throughout the world, from New Zealand over European countries and so on, and I have yet to find a place in the world where it has worked better than it has worked here. Now, one of your questions was whether there had been spikes of methane. In fact, up until 2006, we had a plateauing of methane here in the United States, and that went on for quite some time. But in 2006, we all of a sudden saw an uptick of methane. And we had been wondering how that can be. We looked at all the different sources of methane, including livestock, rice paddies, fossil fuel, everything else. And the cattle herd hadn't changed. The livestock sector didn't all of a sudden emit way more than prior to 2006. But what we found was that it was the onset of fracking, the extraction of fossil fuels using the fracking method that started in 2006, that was largely responsible for the spikes that followed. So that is what I want to say in response to your question on those two issues.
Thank you very much. Did seaweed in one of the states in America?
Oh yeah, sorry. Seaweed, yes, we have done research on approximately 30 different feed additives. Red seaweed is one of them. That's not the seaweed you find at the Irish coast. That is a subtropical seaweed from the Australian coast. It contains an active ingredient called bromoform, which is strongly reducing enteric methane. It's not the only feed additive that works along those lines of disrupting the enzymatic production of methane in the rumen, but it is one. We are working very diligently in finding out what kind of active ingredients in what kind of feed additive can have similar effects. Seaweed on the one side, 3-NOP on the other side, have shown in dozens of publications that enteric methane, which is the main methane source of Irish agriculture, that enteric methane can be reduced anywhere between 20 to over 60%. Now, you don't want to go too high, because if you do go too high with your reductions, you might affect performance. But you can get very sizable reductions. The question is, how does one introduce a feed additive into a herd that's largely pasture-based? But I think that you have so many first-class scientists, it shouldn't be too hard to investigate.
The Maldering Quarter. Okay.